Konnichiwa, brother des. In this video, I want to talk about Applicant Admitted Prior Art. And admissions are quite a dangerous thing in your patent applications, so you always have to be careful to avoid them. And I think for Japanese applicants, admissions are can be particularly dangerous because in the Japanese application, there is a lot of discussion about the prior art or maybe kind of criticizing the prior art, those kind of things. I think maybe that is useful sometimes with the Japanese application and the JPO, but in the USPTO, those kind of comments, they can only damage you. They can't do anything really to help you at all. So as I said, applicant admitted prior art is the topic for today's video, and I put here also the Japanese definitions for an admission and then also for admitted prior art here, just in case you probably already knew this, but just to let you know, the definitions I'm going off of. And basically, there are dangers of admissions. So, for example, a reference that is not prior art can actually become prior art if you admit that it's prior art. So, for example, in your application or during prosecution, if you state that something is prior art or a technology is known, then it is known against you. Even if you're wrong, even if it's not prior art, it will become prior art because you said it is. And that's very dangerous for you. And so the prior art will become, something that's not prior art can become prior art against you. And also the prior art is against you. It's prior art against you, but not against others because it's not really prior art. So, for example, you could have a case where if you accidentally say something is prior art and it really isn't, it will be prior art against you, but maybe not against your competitors in their applications. So it can be dangerous that way. So there's basically 4 situations that I want to talk about that are related to admissions. So the first one is admissions during prosecution. The second is admissions in the specification. And then third is about IDSs, which references disclosed in IDSs are generally not applicant admitted prior art. And then something about Jepson claims. Jepson claims are not recommended to be used. They generally aren't used anymore, but this is part of the rule, so I wanted to explain that the preamble of a Jepson claim could be applicant admitted prior art. So we're going to go through all 4 of these right now. I think the biggest one here, the biggest ones are the first 2 during the prosecution and then the specification. So during prosecution, a statement by an applicant that is made during prosecution identifying the work of another as prior art, that will be applicant admitted prior art. So as you can see, it's the work of another, so it excludes the applicant's own work. Your own work cannot be prior art against yourself because you invented it and you already knew about it. It's kind of, it's an exception to the rule. And so, for example, if there is a statement that is made, it can be relied upon by an examiner for both anticipation and obviousness. This means that if you say something is prior art, an examiner can say, okay, the applicant said this is prior art, so I can use this reference or disclosure to give you a 102, which is anticipation, or a 103 rejection, which is obviousness. And regardless, the third point, regardless of whether the admitted prior art would otherwise qualify as prior art under the statutory categories of 35 USC 102. Okay, what this means is even if these references or things that you said are prior art, that you admitted that are prior art, even if it's not really prior art under 102, it can be used against you as prior art to reject your claims. So, and the fourth point kind of restates this. So if you have a situation where maybe something that is maybe some disclosure or reference anticipates the claim but does not qualify as prior art under 102, it may be rejected. Your claim may be rejected as being anticipated even without citing to 35 U.S.C. 102. So this means the examiner can say, you said this is prior art, it anticipates your claim, therefore I'm rejecting your claim, without even citing a rule at all. And so you can see here that your admission can be quite dangerous if it's not correct. And also, during prosecution, you don't really want to help the examiner reject your claims. So, making admissions can be problematic for that as well. Okay, so moving on, in the specification. So this is things that are written in your disclosure or shown in your figures. So, for example, a prior art label in a figure that shows another's work can be relied on an examiner as admitted prior art. So if you have a figure and you say that, it's someone else's work, which I don't recommend that in your U.S. applications. There's no reason to put prior art in a figure because it can be, we'll see a situation in a minute where it was a problem. But it has to be labeled as prior art. So in that situation, the examiner can use that figure or your disclosure as admitted prior art. So if you have like a figure 1 and it's someone else's work and it says prior art, the examiner can use that figure and maybe find some other prior art to combine and give you a 103 rejection. And then the second bullet point here, a new improvement added to the prior art figure should not be considered as admitted prior art. So this means if you have a figure and it shows another's work and it's labeled as prior art, if you put some changes or some new kind of modifications on that figure, that will not be considered prior art. That would be considered possibly new. Okay, so everything in the figure, if you change the figure, your changes should not be considered prior art if they're new improvements. But everything that is already in that figure, when you put it in there in your application, that would be considered prior art. And here's an example. It's actually a Japanese applicant. It's a 1975 case, so it's pretty old, but in this situation, this applicant, Nomiya-san, he this is a circuit diagram here, semiconductor figures. So he had the figure 1 and figure 2 here is the prior art, but the red portions are new. So he invented the red portions. So these two figures were in his application, and the examiner used these figures, and not considering the red portions, but just the figures themselves, and then found another piece of prior art, and then combined it and rejected the claims. And the argument was in this case that these figures, even though it says they're prior art, to the Japanese applicant, to their U.S. application, it wasn't, at the time, it wasn't prior art. That was the argument. They argued that. And the court said it doesn't matter if it's not prior art against your U.S. application. You said it's prior art by labeling it here, so therefore it is prior art against you. So that was the problem here, and this Nomiya-san lost his case. Okay, so moving on, let's talk briefly about IDSs, information disclosure statements. As you know, in the United States, there is a duty to disclose. You have to send your references or things that you know about or that anyone working on the case knows about has to go to the patent office. However, if you're just listing references in an IDS, that's not taken as an admission of prior art. But be careful, because there's some portions in an IDS you can put like a comments in a box, little comment box or something. Don't say that, don't call anything prior art or make any admissions in your IDS, because if you make an admission in the IDS, and if you say something is prior art, that could be prior art against you. But if you just list the reference, just listing it as disclosure with no comments, then you'll probably be safe, and listing the reference would not be an admission as prior art. Okay. And then quickly, let me go through Jepson Claims. I put a note here, avoid. You should avoid Jepson Claims anyway. They're rarely useful, and they're kind of an old style of claiming. Basically, in a Jepson claim, I summarized it here. The preamble is general description of elements that are conventional or known. So so basically, the way you do a Jepson claim is you say, a semiconductor device having blah blah blah, wherein the improvement comprises. And so your preamble is basically the known art, but the improvement is going to be in the body of your claim. And that's how the style of this claim is. So the preamble comprising a general description of all the elements or steps of the claim combination which are conventional or known. And then you have a phrase such as wherein the improvement comprises. And then that phrase, you will have elements, steps, or relationships that the applicant considers as the new or improved portion. So as you can see there, you have the Jepson claim has, in the preamble, has conventional known stuff, and then in the body of the claim, it's got your new things, which is what your improvement is. So regarding an applicant admission of prior art, there is an implied admission that what you put in the preamble is the work of another, and you're admitting that it's prior art. This is a little bit different because this admission, you can overcome this admission. You can argue back against it, and you might be able to avoid having your preamble be admitted prior art. So as you say here, as it says here, implied admission can be overcome. For example, if the applicant shows the preamble is applicant's own work or something like that. Okay, so a final comment here. So what can we do to avoid applicant admitted prior art? I would say in general, just it's really not a good thing to make any admissions, but sometimes if you have your application in Japan and you translate it and you incorporate it by reference or something like that, you may not be able to avoid some of these statements. But what I can tell you here, just 3 examples in how to avoid this, is avoid discussing prior art in the specification. And if you must discuss the prior art, be very sure and very careful that it is prior art, and be very careful when you describe it. Because if any description, any features of that admitted prior art is going to be an admission against you. So that can be dangerous. And then secondly, avoid including prior art in figures. If you do include prior art in figures, you must label it as prior art. But I would really recommend avoid doing what Nomiya-san did. Don't use the prior art figure and then draw on it. That's very dangerous. And then if you can avoid it, don't put prior art into figures that's someone else's work. If it's your own work, that's okay, but if it's another's work, then it could be a problem. And then third point here, avoid admissions in office action responses. You can even make admissions in office action responses. If you say the prior art has A, B, and C features, and the prior art only has A and B features, the examiner could say against you that it has A, B, and C features, and maybe they can reject your claim. So be very careful about discussing the prior art in the office action responses as well. Okay, so I hope you can learn something from the video today, and I look forward to see you in the next video. ありがとうございました。